Have you ever wondered, why is life filled with so much suffering? Why do we keep chasing happiness, only to fall again into disappointment, anxiety, and regret? Why do the things we love and cherish eventually change or disappear, no matter how tightly we try to hold on? More than 2.500 years ago, a young prince renounced his golden palace, his wife, his child, and his throne to seek the answers to these very questions. He discovered an unshakable truth: life is suffering. But this suffering is not hopelessness, not a dead end, it is, in fact, the gateway to enlightenment. Suffering is something no one wants to face. Yet none of us can avoid it. Each of us carries our own kind of pain. Some suffer because of loss, others because of loneliness, some because of unfulfilled love, and others because they have too much to protect. And sometimes, when we believe we are the happiest, we are in fact planting the seeds of future suffering. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches, not in the sky, not in the midst of the sea, not entering into the clefts of mountains. There is no place on earth where one may escape the results of one's own deeds. Dhammapada, verse 127. This teaching is not only about karma, it reminds us that suffering is woven into life itself. Like a mirror reflecting the truth of impermanence, where everything changes, fades, and arises again in an endless cycle. But the Buddha did not teach us to be pessimistic. He did not say, life is suffering, to make us despair. Rather, he revealed the true nature of suffering, so that we no longer fear it. For only when we look deeply into suffering can we see its true cause. And only when we understand the cause can we find the way to end it. It is like a person who is ill. If they never realize they are sick, they will continue to suffer in ignorance. But once they acknowledge the illness, they can begin to heal. In the same way, the truth of suffering, dukkha, is the Buddha's diagnosis for humankind. It does not lead to despair, it leads to awakening. When the Buddha was still Prince Siddhartha, he lived surrounded by luxury and pleasure. But one day, when he ventured beyond the palace walls, he saw four sights that awakened his heart: an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a serene monk walking in peace. Those four encounters changed his life forever. He realized, aging, sickness, and death are not just the fate of others. They are the truth of all living beings. From that moment, he set out on his great journey to discover the path of liberation from suffering. For all beings, suffering is not something to avoid, it is something to understand. When we understand suffering, we no longer fear it. Just as a sailor who knows the nature of waves no longer panics at sea. One who understands life's nature no longer despairs when it changes. In the Samyutta Nikāya, Connected Discourses, the Buddha said, monks, whoever sees suffering, sees the cause of suffering. Whoever sees the cause, sees the cessation. Whoever sees the cessation, sees the path. Samyutta Nikāya, Book 5, The Four Noble Truths. Thus, recognizing suffering is the first step toward enlightenment. Suffering is not darkness. It is the lamp that allows us to see the way. Someone once asked, if life is suffering, is it even worth living? The Buddha smiled and replied, yes, because it is through suffering that compassion arises. It is through pain that we learn love. Without suffering, how would one ever understand what happiness truly means? Suffering, when viewed with wisdom, becomes the soil in which awakening grows. It does not come to punish us, it comes to awaken us. And when the heart awakens, suffering becomes our greatest teacher, teaching us to live, to love, and to let go. Are you suffering from what you have lost? Are you anxious about what has yet to come? Pause for a moment. Take a deep breath. And listen to the truth of the noble truth of suffering, dukkha. A truth not to escape from, but to understand. Because once we understand, we will see that suffering is not destiny. It is a reminder to awaken. When the Buddha proclaimed the Four Noble Truths, he began with the truth of suffering, dukkha, the first and most fundamental truth of existence. He did not start with happiness, because until we see the true nature of suffering, we will continue to be controlled by it without realizing. Just like a sick person, if they do not know what disease they have, even with medicine in hand, they will not know how to heal. Suffering, in the Buddha's teaching, is not merely physical or emotional pain. It is the total state of dissatisfaction and restlessness that pervades all of life. Whether big or small, it is the sigh of loss, the anxiety of possession, the fear of change, and the emptiness that comes even after obtaining what one once desired. The Buddha described suffering in layers. From the obvious to the subtle, some visible to all, others only understood through deep insight. He spoke of 8 types of suffering and 3 levels of suffering. The 8 types of suffering are: the suffering of birth, the suffering of aging, the suffering of illness, the suffering of death, the suffering of separation from loved ones, the suffering of association with those we dislike, the suffering of not getting what we desire, the suffering inherent in the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, which are constantly changing and unstable. Every human being experiences these sufferings. From the very moment of birth, our first cry is a cry of suffering. The baby leaves the warmth of the mother's womb to enter a cold, unfamiliar world. As we grow, we suffer because of learning, worries, and responsibilities. As we age, we suffer as the body weakens, memory fades, and friends depart one by one. When illness comes, we suffer from pain, helplessness, and fear. And when death arrives, we suffer as we must leave behind everything we once held dear. In the Anguttara Nikāya, the numerical discourses, the Buddha said, whether one wishes it or not, there are 4 things none can escape: birth, aging, sickness, and death. Anguttara Nikāya, Book of Fours. But suffering does not arise only from misfortune. It also hides within what we call happiness. A person in love may feel joy, yet deep down they fear losing the one they love. A wealthy person may possess riches and fame, yet they live in constant anxiety of losing them. Even joy, when clung to, becomes the seed of suffering. The Buddha called this viparinama dukkha, the suffering of change. For everything that arises will also cease. Whatever comes, must also go. Nothing remains unchanged. Once, a king asked the Buddha, "Lord, is there anything in this world that lasts forever?" The Buddha smiled and replied, "Great king, whatever is born will also decay. Whatever has form will eventually disappear." The king was silent for a long time. Everything he had built, his palace, his power, his fame, was all transient. And he realized that the fear of losing is the deepest suffering of humankind. Suffering does not arise only when we lose something. Sometimes, even without loss, the heart remains restless. This is sankhara dukkha, the suffering inherent in existence itself, born from constant change in body and mind. Every moment, the body transforms, cells die and renew, breath flows in and out, blood moves, thoughts arise and fade away. Nothing stays still. Yet we want everything to remain the same. And that desire, born from clinging to what is impermanent, is suffering itself in the Dhammapada. The Buddha said, "There is no fire like passion, no river like craving." Dhammapada, verse 251. It is this craving, the endless wanting, the urge to hold on, that binds human beings to suffering. When we learn to be content, suffering lessens. When we accept impermanence, pain softens. But when we cling, suffering grows, like a flame fed with oil. Once, someone asked the Buddha, "Blessed One, do you ever suffer?" He smiled and said, "I too have felt pain, but I no longer suffer. For I understand the nature of suffering." The Buddha still had a body, so he still experienced pain. But he was free from attachment, therefore free from suffering. Pain is a sensation. Suffering is the mind's reaction to that sensation. If we can observe and let go, then even amidst suffering, we can find peace. Understanding suffering does not make us weak, it makes us stronger. Because the one who dares to look deeply into suffering is the one who truly begins to understand themselves. When we see that all things are impermanent, we are no longer controlled by fear. When we recognize suffering as part of life, we stop running away and learn to walk through it with serenity. When the Buddha spoke of the first noble truth, he did not merely declare that life is suffering. He also explained why suffering arises, and how it can be understood with wisdom. If one knows only that life is suffering, but not the cause, despair will follow. But when one clearly sees the origin of suffering, one can transform it into insight. The Buddha taught, "Monks, it is through ignorance that beings act. It is through craving that they wander in birth and death. When ignorance ceases, actions cease. When actions cease, consciousness ceases. Thus, all suffering comes to an end." Samyutta Nikāya, the 12 links of dependent origination, ignorance, not seeing reality as it truly is the root of all suffering. We do not suffer merely because of loss, but because we do not understand the nature of loss. We do not suffer simply because things change, but because we want to hold on to what cannot be held. Thus, the Buddha said, "No one causes us to suffer more than our own mind." Dhammapada, verse 42. When our minds are restless and attached, we imprison ourselves in sorrow. But when our minds awaken and let go, we become free. Suffering does not come from the world. It comes from the way we see it, someone once asked the Buddha. Blessed One, why don't you use your power to remove the suffering of all beings? The Buddha smiled and said, I do not erase suffering with miracles. I only show the path that leads beyond it. Whoever walks that path shall be liberated. The Buddha did not perform magic or grant salvation through prayer. He illuminated the path so that people could walk it themselves. For suffering cannot be ended through mere desire. It ends only through understanding and practice in the Majjhima Nikāya, middle-length discourses. There is a famous parable, the man shot by a poisoned arrow. The Buddha said, when a man is struck by a poisoned arrow, the first thing he must do is remove it. But if he delays, asking, who shot me? From which direction? What kind of wood is this arrow made of? The poison will spread, and he will die before finding the answers. The Buddha was teaching that we suffer not because of the world, but because we endlessly seek causes outside ourselves. Instead of understanding and transforming suffering within, we waste time blaming the world. In the Samyutta Nikāya, the Buddha also taught, monks, suffering is not destiny. Because there is a cause, suffering arises. When that cause ceases, suffering also ceases. Samyutta Nikāya, book verses. If suffering were destiny, no one could ever be free. But because it arises from conditions, it can be ended. Like a fire, when there is no more fuel, it naturally goes out. When ignorance, craving, and attachment are released, suffering dissolves. Venerable Sariputta once told his disciples, the wise do not fear suffering, for within suffering lies the seed of wisdom. When we see suffering, we do not run, we learn. When we accept it, we do not surrender, we awaken. This statement reveals a profound truth. Suffering is not our enemy. It is a silent teacher, guiding us toward maturity and understanding. One day, while walking for alms with his disciples, the Buddha saw a man weeping for his deceased child. He paused and asked gently, are you suffering because of loss, or because you do not understand that all things are impermanent? The man looked up with tears and said, Lord, I suffer because I have lost. But hearing your words, I realize that loss itself is part of life. The Buddha replied, whoever understands impermanence is no longer made to suffer by it. Within suffering lies impermanence. Within impermanence lies non-self. And within non-self lies freedom. When we truly see that the self is not truly me, that this body, these feelings, these thoughts are merely passing phenomena, then the self that suffers also dissolves. Hence, the Buddha taught, what truly belongs to you that you can hold forever? When you see this clearly, you cling to nothing. Samyutta Nikāya, the 5 aggregates. The purpose of spiritual practice is not to escape suffering, but to understand it and pass through it. When suffering is understood, it is no longer suffering. Like ice melting into water, the substance is the same, but the state has changed. When suffering is illuminated by wisdom, it becomes the very path leading us to nirvana, the ultimate peace. When we hear, life is suffering, the mind often resists. Everyone wants happiness, and everyone fears pain. But the Buddha taught that true happiness begins when we stop and look deeply into our suffering. For suffering does not come to torment us. It comes to teach us how to live. He said, when the wise see suffering, they learn compassion. When they see impermanence, they learn to let go. When they see non-self, they discover freedom. If we had never suffered, we would never truly understand the pain of others. Through suffering, we learn compassion. Through loss, we learn gratitude. Through loneliness, we learn self-love. And through storms, we learn to cherish peace. The Buddha said, just as the lotus grows in muddy water, so too does the wise person grow amidst suffering. Anguttara Nikāya. Suffering is not meant to be escaped, it is meant to be understood. When pain arises, instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Try asking, what is this trying to teach me? Every form of suffering is a lesson. About patience, about letting go, about impermanence, and about unconditional love. When we can transform suffering into wisdom, every moment, every situation becomes a temple of awakening. In modern life, suffering is not only illness or loss. It also takes the form of pressure, comparison, anxiety, loneliness, and the feeling of not being enough. People chase after fame, wealth, and social approval. Yet the more they chase, the emptier they feel. Because true happiness does not lie outside. It resides within the peace of one's own heart. When the mind is attached to the self, we always feel lacking, never enough. But when the mind pauses and breathes mindfully, we realize every breath is a gift. Every day of life is a miracle. Happiness is not the absence of suffering. It is the ability to smile amidst suffering. The Buddha taught that there are 3 ways to face suffering. Keycap 1, avoid it, and it grows stronger. Keycap 2, fight it, and the mind grows weary. Keycap 3, observe and accept it, and it dissolves like clouds drifting away. Only when we look directly at suffering with mindfulness does it transform into understanding. And understanding is the root of freedom. A meditator once asked his teacher, how can I stop suffering? The teacher smiled and said, do not try to drive suffering away. Sit with it. Look at it as you would an old friend. When you are calm enough, it will leave on its own. Mindfulness does not erase suffering, but it allows us to see suffering without fear. To understand suffering is to return home to ourselves. When the mind is peaceful, suffering becomes lighter. When we see that all things are impermanent, we begin to feel gratitude even for the unpleasant. For it is those very things that teach us how to love truly, live honestly, and let go gracefully. Happiness does not come from eliminating suffering, but from transforming it. Like mud and lotus, without mud, the lotus cannot bloom. Without suffering, one cannot appreciate the value of peace. Therefore, instead of praying for the end of suffering, pray for the wisdom to understand it. The truth of suffering does not make us pessimistic. It makes us awake amidst life. For only by understanding suffering do we know what true happiness is. A happiness not dependent on circumstance, but born from a calm heart, clear mind, and grateful soul. After realizing the truth of suffering, dukkha, the Buddha did not stop there. He went further, discovering the cause of suffering, samudaya, and the path that leads to its cessation, magga. Thus, suffering was no longer a burden, but the key to nirvana. He said, like a skilled physician, I show the illness, I show the cause, I show the cure, and I show the path that leads to recovery. Majjhima Nikāya, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, the path the Buddha revealed is the Noble Eightfold Path. 8 practices that help us transcend suffering, awaken wisdom, and attain true peace. They are: Keycap 1, right view, understanding correctly. Keycap 2, right intention, thinking wisely. Keycap 3, right speech, speaking truthfully. Keycap 4, right action, acting virtuously. Keycap 5, right livelihood, living ethically. Keycap 6, right effort, cultivating wholesome energy. Keycap 7, right mindfulness, being aware in every moment. Keycap 8, right concentration, developing a calm and focused mind. It is the middle way, avoiding both indulgence and self-mortification. The way of wisdom and compassion when one begins to walk the Noble Eightfold Path. They no longer see suffering as an enemy. Suffering becomes a friend, reminding them to return to themselves, to observe their mind and habits, and to walk each step with mindfulness. That is the moment when the truth of suffering, dukkha, transforms into the truth of the path, magga. From understanding suffering to transcending it, an enlightened person is not someone who never suffers, but one who walks through suffering with a mindful smile. They know that every emotion is like a cloud drifting across the sky of the mind, and every pain will pass. Just as night dissolves when the dawn arises, we cannot choose a life without suffering, but we can choose a mind unafraid of suffering. Whenever hardship arises, instead of resentment, smile and remind yourself, this is my chance to learn, my path to grow. When we understand suffering, it dissolves. When we accept it, the heart rests in peace. In that moment, we realize suffering is no longer a chain, it becomes the wings that help us rise. No longer darkness, it becomes the light that guides the way. No longer an ending, it becomes the beginning of awakening. For without suffering, the Buddha would not have become the Buddha. And without suffering, we would never know how to return home to our hearts. So when you encounter suffering, remember, it is not punishment, but a lesson sent to help you grow. Listen to suffering with an awakened heart. For within every tear lies the seed of a smile, and within every pain lies the seed of liberation, the Buddha said. As one who awakens the sleeper, as one who shows the way in darkness, as light that dispels the shadow of ignorance, I am but the one who shows the path. You must walk it yourself. That is the final message of the truth of suffering, dukkha. No one can liberate us except ourselves. When we understand suffering and walk the path beyond it, when you sit quietly and feel the wind pass by, remember that each sound is as impermanent as life itself. If you can smile in this very moment, even with a gentle smile, then you have understood the truth of suffering, not through knowledge, but through the experience of your heart. And when your heart remains calm amidst change, when joy and sorrow no longer pull you apart, when you can love without attachment, that is the moment when suffering dissolves, and enlightenment begins. Suffering is the teacher. Suffering is the doorway, and the one who walks through it is the awakened one. If you are on the path of understanding suffering, trust that you are walking the right way, the way of the Buddha, the path of peace and wisdom. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha.